and add my very warm welcome. It's lovely to see you here. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I hope you've enjoyed the evening so far. My name's William, as Naren has already said. And what is it that Christians believe? That is the title of this week that we're having. So this evening, and then tomorrow evening and Thursday evening, then over our Sunday services. And we're going to be looking at the questions, who is Jesus tonight? And then why bother with Jesus tomorrow evening? And then why did Jesus die on Thursday evening? Did he rise? Can we believe it? On Sunday morning, and then Sunday afternoon, how can I be sure? They'll all be online. So if there's anything you think, well, I'd love to hear a bit more of this, we'd love you to download them, or indeed, even better, come here tomorrow night if you're free, or on Thursday night, and hear some more. So first of all, first and foremost, what I want to suggest is that Christianity is about Jesus Christ. I got started as a Christian around about 35 years ago when I was asked to spend a little bit of time away from my boarding school for reasons which are none of your business. And I went to stay with my grandfather, who was a very clear Christian. And over the course of the weekend, he explained to me that Christianity is about Jesus, which I have to say was something of a shock to me. I thought Christianity was about sort of strange services in antique buildings with people in weird clothes, rules, ritual, religion, rote, and that sort of stuff. And therefore, no surprise to find that in our first talk in this series, What Do Christians Believe?, we focus in on Jesus Christ. Of course, opinions abound concerning the person of Jesus. When I got started as a Christian worker, I was down in Bromley, and I remember doing a vox pop in the days before you had videos, not videos, but videos, and I remember going around with the microphone and the recorder, all the rest of it, in the Glades shopping centre. Who do you think Jesus was? And a complete range of answers. So, first century social reformer, a brilliant teacher, good guy, Che Guevara, and then right down to a figment of the capitalist elite used to suppress the masses. I mean, we had the whole lot. And when I was growing up in our kind of bedroom, there was one of those pictures, of Victorian, Jesus with the long wispy, looking surprisingly English, holding a lamb in his arms and so forth. And then all those images have been captured on celluloid, Franco Zeffirelli and Jesus of Nazareth, Andrew Lloyd Webber, Jesus Christ Superstar, and then Mel Gibson, The Passion of the Christ. When I was at college some time ago now, it was fashionable to suggest that no one really knew who Jesus was. The New Testament Gospels were essentially an invention of the first century church, and they were fixed up by the disciples, over-exaggerated stories to try and depict what the disciples wanted to convey. And then evidence for earlier dates of the Christian Gospels began to emerge, and the eyewitness narrative of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels of the New Testament, became increasingly self-evident to those who were prepared to read the Gospels. Place names, people's names, botanical details, meteorological data, geographical, historical fact. So what I want us to do is to go back to one of those eyewitness accounts, the gospel written by, or the narrative written by, Jesus' closest disciple, known as John. And I wonder if you could take hold of that, John's gospel. Gospel just means news, just means good news. It means announcement. Here is the announcement from Jesus' closest disciple, who was commissioned by him. And I've asked Runty if she would be happy to read from page 14. So if you could turn to page 14, we're breaking into the middle of chapter 5. Runty, if you're happy to.
So we're on page 14, John chapter 5, beginning at verse 19. So about 2/3 of the way down the page. So Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. The Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honour the Son, just as they honour the Father. Whoever does not honour the Son does not honour the Father who sent him. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes in him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment.
Thanks, Ronti, very much indeed. Well, who is Jesus? Straight away, notice his claims. In fact, you can see it right up there in verse 17 on the left-hand side of the page, the final verse there in the first paragraph. My Father is working until now, and I am working. And then the last few words of the next paragraph, verse 18, making himself equal with God. And then in verse 19 there, you can see the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees his Father doing. And then if you look down to verse 21 on page 14, as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. And verse 22, the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. So who does Jesus say he is? Well, he says he is doing God's work. He says he makes himself equal with God. He claims to do the very work of God. And he says that God the Father, the creator of the universe, has entrusted to him the task of giving spiritual life to you and me today, to whoever he will, and indeed the task of judging all of humanity beyond the grave. They're pretty big claims. He claims to be God himself. He claims to be our creator. He claims as creator to have broken into this universe. He claims to be able to give you life from God tonight even. And he claims that at the end of your life, you will meet Jesus face to face as your judge, as I will. Now, this extreme nature of Jesus' statements is repeated regularly through this account of his teaching. So turn to page 27. I want you to see that this is just not a one-off. Page 27. Right at the bottom of the page there, sentence number 58, Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now, Abraham is a figure over 2,000 years before Jesus was born, and the phrase I am is God's name for himself. I am. Before Abraham was, I am. His enemies were very clear what he was saying. They picked up stones to stone him. Turn over a few more pages to page 32. Page 32. And at the top of the page there, page 32, verse number 30, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. Again, no mistake about what he's claiming. The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Turn over a few more pages to page 43. This is the last piece of research for us. Page 43. And have a look at this conversation between Jesus and Philip, another of his disciples. Halfway down, sentence number 8 of chapter 14. Philip said to them, Lord, show us the Father, that's enough. Jesus said to them, verse 9, have I been with you so long and you still don't know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Now maybe if you turn back then to page 14, that's our research done. There is Jesus' claim. He is no less than God. He's entered into this world as creator in order to give life, and you and I will meet him at the end of our lives as our judge. A friend of mine in the 1990s was a banker, and in the days when bankers travelled first class, he was going first class on the Eurostar over to France. And as he was travelling, this really scruffy guy at Waterloo came in and sat down next to him in the first class, and my friend said, I did what all true bankers did in those days. I raised the newspaper up high and kept myself to myself. But all the way through the journey, people kept coming up to this scruffy guy and saying, can I have your autograph? And so forth. And eventually, curiosity got the better of him, and he had to lowered the corner of his paper and said, excuse me, do you mind asking who you are? Bryan Adams. Now, this was unfortunately completely lost on my friend, as it appears to be lost on quite a few of you, but Bryan Adams, one of the most famous rock stars of the 1990s and early 1980s. And of course, he didn't have a clue, and he said, oh, very interesting, raised his paper and carried on with the journey. But when he got home, his daughters, who were teenagers, were absolutely livid with him. You know, you could have had his autograph, you could have got a free ticket to the next concert and so forth. You've actually met Bryan Adams. Well, here is Jesus' claim, that if his disciples had travelled with Jesus, they'd travel with God. If they'd spoken to Jesus, they'd spoken to God. If you've listened to Jesus, you've listened to God. Shaken hands with Jesus, hugged Jesus, rubbed shoulders with Jesus, touched God, rubbed shoulders with God, met God. This, of course, has huge implications. And I'd like you to turn back to page 14 to our key little section, just a snippet of Jesus' teaching. It's all like this, by the way. It's all like this. And have a look at that sentence 21. Left-hand side, page 14, towards the bottom. As the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. The Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son. And then if you cast your eye across to the right-hand page and have a look at the top of the page there, sentence 20, verse 25, it's as if Jesus here draws a timeline and he plots what's going to happen when upon it. So, verse 25, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. So now an hour has come when spiritual life is available from God through Jesus Christ. But then, verse 27, he's given him authority to execute judgment because he's the Son of Man. Don't marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in their tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who've done good to eternal life, those who've done evil to eternal judgment. Now, I know this doesn't quite work, so please don't put in one of the questions afterwards, God doesn't need this, but imagine God were to have a diary. He doesn't need one, and then it wouldn't be paper, it would be, one of these ones. And imagine God were to have a diary. Here we have the opening page and creation. Here we have the closing page when all who have ever walked this earth, says Jesus, will be summoned to meet him in judgment. And here we have his first coming, which we're reading about here. And here we have his life and his death and his resurrection and his purpose to offer life, spiritual life, from God our Creator to each of us freely tonight, to every human being as they hear the message of Jesus Christ. Sometimes people say, oh, when a person dies, they've gone to meet their Maker. Jesus says, they've come to meet me. Now, I'm aware, and this is only the first evening, I'm aware some of those claims are very, very strong. And you might be saying, well, if I was to stand up here and say that, I am none other than God, I am the Father one, you would say, you're a nutter. And you would be quite right. But therefore you're wanting to say, well, where's the evidence? And the thing I love about the Bible and the teaching of Jesus is that it is so linearly logical. He's always answering the question that we're next asking as the logic follows. And what you discover on page 15 is, having made these extraordinary claims, then in verse 30, where it says witnesses to Jesus, through to the end of the chapter, he runs through three key pillars of evidence. I mean, if a lot of not yours, a lot of my kids are starting exams today, okay? So a lot of people are doing exams at the moment. If you were the examiner, you would be circling this in red over and over again, because the word testimony and the word witness are the same word in the original language. And so if you look at 31, if I alone bear witness about myself, my witness is not deemed true. There is another who bears witness about me, and I know that the witness that he bears about me is true. You sent to John, he himself has borne witness. Not that the witness that I received, do you see witness, 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 testimony, evidence, 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 evidence. And he puts forward three areas of evidence. First, the witness of his disciples, those who were actually there and saw it. Secondly, the work of Jesus. Third, the word of the Father. May I take us through those three, just to scan out, and really you could spend a whole week, in fact months, on each area of evidence as we explore what God has put together so that we can believe who Jesus is. Let's start with the work of Jesus. Do you see there in verse 36? The witness, or the testimony that I have, is greater than that of John the Baptist. For the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. In other words, you want to know that I'm from God? Look at the work. Look at the work. Now, in its immediate context, this refers to the miracle he has just performed. And what Jesus has just done is to raise a man who has been paralyzed for 38 years. You can read about it earlier in the chapter. We haven't got time to look at it now. He's been lying on his pallet for 38 years. I want you to picture this man. I once asked a medic, when I was speaking on this passage, what would this bloke have been like after 38 years lying flat, unable to move? And he said, have you ever broken a limb, William? Yes, I did. When I was 15, I broke my right leg, very badly, actually. And it was in plaster for 12 weeks. What was it like when it came out? It was shriveled. I could hardly move the thing, and it took a whole year of physio and so forth before I reached the peak of physical fitness that you see standing before you this evening. Okay? Now, picture 38 years that I'm told by the physicians that actually limbs begin to contract, contractures, and I'm told by the therapist that it takes months of physio in order to get the blood moving properly again so somebody can even sit up. And Jesus just speaks to this guy, get up. And he gets up. Now, and we can't say that this is a kind of dynamo or a David Blaine. This is not sleight of hand, deceptive illusion. It is publicly witnessed, it is openly acknowledged even by his enemies, and it's widely reported. I come from a farming community down in the in the southwest, down in Cornwall, and I grew up in a small village. We all knew everybody. There was Peter, who was significantly disabled. There was Farmer Olver, who used to mix the scrumpy with gin to make really quite a potent concoction. He was blind in one eye for reasons we needn't go into. And there was Mr. Elin, who lost a leg in the First World War. And if Mr. Elin had walked into church one day with his leg back on, or Farmer Olver had been able to see through his eye again, or Peter had walked in, we all would have known. There's no sleight of hand there. That's not a dynamo. And in this section, we have Jesus feeding 5,000 men alone, without the women and children counted. We have Jesus walking on water. We have Jesus healing a man who was born blind, that is, creating sight. And in this gospel, we have Jesus turning water into wine, raising a man who's been dead for four days, begun to putrefy, and himself being raised from the dead. Evidence, 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 evidence. Public. You may say that sort of thing just can't have happened because God doesn't exist. And because God doesn't exist, that sort of thing can't have happened. And I think I'd want to just begin to suggest there that there is an element of circularity about that argument. Listen to the philosopher David Bentley Hart. This is a feat of sublimely circular thinking. Physics explains everything, which we know because anything physics cannot explain does not exist, which we know because whatever exists must be explicable by physics, which we know because physics explains everything. There is something here almost superstitious. So there's just one pillar. As I say, I would love to have a whole series of it. We could look at his teaching. There's no other teaching like it. You know, you read a bit of Plato. I don't read a lot of Plato. I occasionally read Plato. Read a bit of Plato, you get 1,000 words. You might get one idea. You think, oh, that's interesting. Sentence after sentence after sentence after sentence with Jesus. You look at any of the teaching of any other religious leaders, you don't find this linear logic, you don't find this public accountability, what they call falsifiable evidence. You just don't find it. Look how different the teaching of Jesus is. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, that's profoundly different, isn't it, to many other religions. And that's just his teaching. And then we haven't looked at his perfect life, his character, which is more beautiful than the greatest of all of his miracles. We'll be looking at his death and resurrection later in the week. Pillar number 1. Pillar number 2, I think we've got time just to touch on pillar number 2, and it's there in sentence 37. So just glance down towards the bottom of page 15, and you'll see here he's talking about his Father's word. The Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you've never heard, his form you've never seen. You don't have his word abiding in you if you don't believe the one whom he has sent. Turn the page. You search the scriptures, that's the first half of the Bible, the Old Testament, because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. In other words, second stream of evidence, not my works now, but God's word. That is the first half of the Bible written over 2,000 years that again and again and again speaks of the coming of Jesus. The point here is that Jesus did not emerge like a rabbit out of a hat in 33 AD, in his 30 AD in his public ministry. He didn't come out of the blue. He was anticipated, he was announced, he was expected over 2,000 years. And therefore, with 2,000 years of what we call the Old Testament, that's the first part of the Bible, we've got a matrix of explanation of Jesus, so that when he comes, we know who he is and why he's come. And that gives us what you call a matrix of interpretation. Again, we could spend weeks on this, but let me give you just a little illustration of it. Why it's so important. Last summer, about this time, one of the senior members of the church here asked me to come down to their house in Blackheath and to meet. He was going to invite a whole 8 couples, to dinner, friends of his children's friends' parents. And he'd said to them, none of them are particular churchgoers or anything. He said, the vicar's coming, come and have supper, ask him whatever question you like. And he said to me, you got 5 minutes, William. What he didn't tell me was that he'd said to them, make sure you give the vicar a run for his money. Okay, so they obliged their host. I can tell you, when I arrived, there were 2 M&A lawyers, 1 barrister, and somebody with a PhD in Prussian history. I tell you, the adrenaline was pumping, and they pumped me with questions. But one of their biggest concerns was this. They said, look, okay, I'm happy to take this as it happened, but it's just your interpretation. And I was able to say no, because we have a matrix of 2,000 years of interpretative anticipation of the coming of Jesus. Now, I used a very silly illustration, and you may feel this doesn't work at all, so I'll give it a go. It was the time of the Qatar FIFA fix-up, do you remember? The alleged Qatar FIFA fix-up. And the Sunday Times was full of all their reports. And I said to them, look, when it comes to the Qatar FIFA fix-up alleged, it's all very well to say it happened, and maybe, actually, that one Qatari official sold a very expensive watch to a Mexican official, and the watch of $50,000 in a brown paper envelope was in payment for a perfectly legitimate sale. Possibly Sepp Blatter was right, and it was just rank racism. But if I could produce a trail of 1,000 emails over 3 years saying, I'll leave the money in a brown paper envelope. It'll be there, 50,000 nice ones. Vote for me in the election. And there are 1,000 emails. You would have to say, if you're a reasonable legal thinker, there is a case to answer. And that's what we have with the word of the Father, you see. Again and again and again, Jesus takes us back to the first part of the Bible. And I mean, I try and read the Bible every year, so I've read the Bible cover to cover on many, many occasions. And I could take you this evening, if you wanted, to the first book of the Bible in the Old Testament, Genesis, to the second book of the Bible, Exodus, Leviticus. I could take you to the Psalms, I could take you to the prophets, and again and again and again and again and again. This is where he will be born. This is how he will be born. This is how he will live. This is the family tree. This is how he will die. And we can go from the virgin birth to his bringing up in simplicity, to his coming from the line of Judah, to his crucifixion, his death, even his resurrection. I'll do it in question time if you want. Not a resurrection, but show you the verses from the Old Testament. And you'll see, yes, interpretative grid. Now, second pillar, do you see? So his claims are extreme. You will meet him when you die. He's come early to bring life from the Creator God. You can try and write it off, but be careful that the way you write it off doesn't just betray unscientific superstition in the way you handle evidence. Because the evidence is there. Not only so, but there are the words of the Father so that we can make sense of why he came. And finally, there's the witness of his disciples. We must draw to a close. Let me just say, with the witness of the disciples, please read it. Again, we could spend weeks on this, but read it. Take it away. You may never have read a gospel as an adult. I try and read gospels one-to-one with people who are investigating the Christian faith. People here would love to do that with you. It's a lovely way to do it over a coffee or what have you. And over the last 20 years, I've read with many people from a legal background, barristers, city lawyers, and so forth. Time and time again, they say this reads like courtroom evidence. Remember one Cornish barrister, Helen, standing up in the Albert Hall. He came from an atheistic background. He started to read this, and he said, the thing is, it just reads like eyewitness material. Apparently, in court, the thing you must not do if you're trying to commit a crime is when you try and get away with it in court, you must not all stitch up the evidence together because you all tell exactly the same story. And there is a sort of authenticity about slight variations. And if these guys had all stitched up, it would be exactly the same story. And then he said the other thing is they always come off really well, the witnesses. And you'll find here repeatedly the disciples come off really badly. I mean, on Sunday morning, the first person to the tomb is a woman. In the first century, I know we don't like this, but in the first century, the last person you would have had if you were wanting to make a case would be to have had a woman being the first witness of the risen Jesus, because he just wouldn't have stood in court. And so Alan stood up there in the Albert Hall saying, as an atheistic barrister, I couldn't just bury the evidence. I had to use my brain and then integrity and take it seriously. Well, there we are. I became a Christian 35 years ago. My images of Jesus were just like in the films, and I guess I treated Jesus like you might treat your insurance salesman. I was on the telephone this morning to Admiral to try and fix up insurance for a 19-year-old boy who is closely related. If you are underwriting any of Admiral's business, I suggest you increase their premiums very substantially as of 12 o'clock this lunchtime. But anyway, there we go. I hope never to speak to Tina, a lovely Welsh lady, ever again, or possibly only once a year when I need to renew the insurance. I treated Jesus just like that. Then I realized I and the Father are one. He is equal with God. He's come to give life from God. I will meet him in judgment. And I could no longer, with good conscience and in real integrity, treat him in that way. Well, there we go. There we are. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. And it's time to hand back over to Aaron. He'll tell us what's happening next.
William, thank you very much. Well, it's time now for dessert and an opportunity maybe to discuss around our tables the claims that have been presented and what William has said. And as part of that, let me remind you, please do take up these slips. Maybe you've already got a question from during the talk, or maybe in your discussion together you'll come up with something that you'd like William to address. And the helpers, as they come round, do give this to them and they'll make sure it comes in our direction. Thank you. Well, let me break into our conversations at that point. Thank you very much for this huge wad of questions that I've got there. So obviously what William has said has generated much discussion and questions, and we will now do our best to get through as many of these as we can. Apologies from the beginning that we certainly won't be able to do them all. I will do my best to ask a representative sample, and I won't duck any of the hard ones. I'll make sure those go William's way. And apologies too if it's only the beginnings of an answer that you were hoping for more. Please do ask William or myself or others afterwards, and we'll see where we get to. William, first of all, a very important question. Who made the crumble?
Yeah, well, Anita made the crumble. There'll be crumble every night this week, so yeah, I'm going to be a bit heavier.
Okay, so let's take a dive. So lots of questions, not surprisingly, following on the talk of evidence, and particularly these Gospels. So, William, some of these may be similar, and you may be able to answer quickly. 4 Gospels. Is it just 2 that were eyewitnesses?
That's right, so Matthew and John, eyewitness material. Mark is, from the oldest and earliest accounts, was the testimony of Peter. I mean, you're the expert on this, but was the testimony of Peter the Apostle, who effectively got Mark to write it for him in Rome. And Luke, personally, Luke travelled with the Apostle Paul, so lots of the Acts, we, Luke was with him. Luke was a doctor, an educated man, and he went round and he interviewed personally what are known as the eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And those 2 phrases are technical, servants of the word, they are authorized communicators of the word, people who've been appointed by Jesus. So Luke is very the great thing about Luke is he uses some of Mark and some of Matthew, so we can check how he uses his sources. And Luke is profoundly conservative in the way he uses his sources. So that's quite helpful. Written independently, using Matthew and Mark, but he uses his sources with great integrity, and I think that strengthens Luke's testimony, actually.
So that's the historical evidence in the Bible. Is there any historical evidence from a non-Christian source that supports what Jesus is claiming in John and in the other biblical books?
Well, I think that the trouble with that question is that I understand where it's coming from. When we stand back from it, it is in danger of being a slightly unfair question, because, of course, all the material was written independently originally. So it wasn't in the Bible originally. It was recognized quickly as being either eyewitness material or not, and we'll have a question on that in a minute. But because it was written independently, what they did was they pulled together the authorized independent material into the New Testament. And so that question is a slightly unfair question, because it was all gathered together in the New Testament. Having said that, you can read the letters to Pliny, you can read Tacitus, you can read Josephus. Be careful, because sometimes Christians in our enthusiasm slightly over-egg it, but there are clear references to Jesus, to John the Baptist, from contemporary historians such as Josephus and Tacitus. Yes?
You just touched on this, but there are other documents, some called Gospels. This is 2 or 3 questions on that. Why didn't everything that was written about Jesus find its way into the Bible?
Well, I'm not quite sure what that question is driving at. There are independent Gospels that were written in the 2nd century, later, mid-2nd century, like you've heard of the Gospel of Thomas and so forth. As pieces of literature, they do not bear the mark of contemporaneous historical material. That's contemporary historical material. So the mark of historical material is you've got place names, people's names, geographical details, botanical. The further you get away from the event, the more kind of mystical and vague the accounts become, sort of vague stories but not rooted in places with specific people who you can check up with. And there's a guy called Peter Williams who's done a huge amount of research on this. He works up in Tyndale. He is the English expert on the 2nd century material, in fact, probably the world expert. He came and lectured here. He was fascinating. He showed us the bar charts of the number of names, place names, people's names per 1,000 words in the Gospels, and it's right up here. And interesting, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's very similar. There's a tiny, tiny difference between them. And then you go to the Gnostic, what's known as the 2nd century Gnostic Gospels, Thomas and so forth, and the number of names, place names, people's names, details and so forth is right down here. And he says that's classic of myth and Odyssey, that you don't have it rooted into history. And you can download the lecture. It was given here on a Thursday lunchtime sometime about 5 years ago. But Google Peter Williams and listen to his great lecture somewhere in America, and it's all there. It's very, very good.
Thank you. Coming back now then to what did find its way into the Bibles, combining, I think, 3 questions. How do we know that what we have is what was written back then and hasn't been changed or exaggerated? How do we know that the words that are written were the original words? And then why should we trust what we find in the Bible, that it's reliable?
Very, very well. Thank you very much. Well, that is a whole. Stuart Morgan's a historian. He trained here in our little scheme here. He's got a PhD in monks or something, any medieval history. I can't remember what it was. Anyway, he got married, and he got married in Singapore, the celebration of years. But there was a lady sort of mingling around at the back there at the beginning, and I said, hello, what's your name? Anne Duggan. She's the professor of medieval history at King's College. And I emailed her earlier this week because I said, when I talked to her, I said, am I right in thinking that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are essentially historical material? And any historian would say, she said, of course. As if I was a sort of undergraduate, sort of course. And so I didn't pursue it any further. I Googled her this week, I emailed her and said, do you remember meeting me on the gallery? And, I felt like a rather silly undergraduate. And she said, she didn't refer to that in her reply, but she said, these Gospels bear the mark of what you would expect to find in historical material. I haven't brought the quote with me, but it's fascinating, Anne Duggan. Now, there are 2 essential, but she said, that is assuming that they have been transmitted without error. And I want to email back to her and say, I think there's very strong evidence that they have been transmitted faithfully. And the reason for that, and I read up again on this morning just to make sure I was clear, is that the Gospels were spread like wildfire. And they spread through different language routes and in different geographical locations, which means very quickly after they were written, we've got the material spreading, like Chinese whispers. And the great thing with Chinese whispers is you can check the person out here who was writing in Syriac, and you can check the person out here who's copied it through into Coptic, and you can check the person out here who's copied it through into Armenian and Latin and Greek. And as you translate them back, you can say, are they saying the same thing? Now, there are tiny differences. And, I'm no scholar, but back at home I've got a Greek New Testament, and all the differences are in the back from the different manuscripts. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of manuscripts. I totaled them up. I wrote it down in the back here because I knew somebody would ask this question. I thought, I'd better swat up on this. And there are 241,000, is that right? Anyway, maybe, oh no, it's 24,000, sorry, yes. This was at 6:30 this morning, so it must have been a bit dark. 24,000 manuscripts. Now, when you think that with, for example, the writing of Tacitus, the number of manuscripts we have are 1 for the first 6 books of his Annals of the Imperial Thingo, and then 1 for books 11 to 16, and for Josephus, 9, and 4 Latin translations. 24,000 is just, the historians, it's a massive, massive, massive amount. So the transmission is what we've got, what they wrote. I wrote down what the director of the British Museum said decades ago now. The last foundation of any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. That's Sir Frederick Kenyon. But then the question is what they wrote what actually happened? That's a very good, important question. And I think the danger is we sometimes think, oh, what happened was it all took part, this is what I thought till I was 19, 20. It all happened. Then people sort of forgot about it for 20 or 30 years. And then they thought, oh, we better write it down, by which stage it had grown and grown and grown. But that cannot possibly have been what happened, because the gospel spread like wildfire. And the people who were the eyewitnesses and servants of the word from Luke's gospel, those guys were the authentic guardians of what happened, and they were based in particular cities: Jerusalem, city in Antioch, Ephesus, Rome. And they were treated as the authoritative kind of collegium, as the scholars call it, the authoritative group. And they were teaching it day after day after day after day. It wasn't that they kind of forgot about it for 30 years and they thought, that's an extraordinary idea, actually, when you stop and think about it. They were teaching it and teaching it and teaching it and teaching it and teaching it. And so when you tell your niece or nephew a story, and 3 years later you tell them the same story, or you read it to them every night, in the bath or whatever it happens to be, and they say, no, it doesn't happen like that, Everybody knew exactly how it happened. And of course they were oral transmission, and in an oral culture, you remember things. You remember things in a way that we don't. So is what happened what they wrote? I personally think we can trust it. And then is what they wrote what happened? Well, don't trust me, trust the head of the British Museum and Anne Duggan and all these other guys.
Okay, so that's why we would take this
sorry.
document seriously, and why we think it needs our attention. A few now questions, therefore, on what we find when we read John's Gospel, for example. What is the role of the miracles in the Bible accounts? Would you believe in Jesus if the Bible didn't contain any miracles?
Well, two good questions. Could you turn to the very penultimate page, page 60 of your John's Gospel? Very helpfully, the author has told us why he wrote. Page 60, top of the page, the purpose. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Here's John penning this out, probably 80 AD, something like this, writing it down carefully, having been there in his old age now. These are written so that you may believe. Signs are like signposts. They're significant events. So the miracles are not just a random set of kapow, sort of, Batman special, Spider-Man stuff. No, the miracles are significant events designed specifically to demonstrate that Jesus is who God said he was. And I would be happy to try and take you to every single one of the miracles and tie it back to the Old Testament and show you that in one way or another, every miracle is a fulfillment of what is promised in the first half of the Bible. And therefore the signs are carefully chosen events, activities, to show that God is breaking into his world. Would I believe if the miracles weren't there? I don't, that's a very good question. I don't know. I've never been asked that before. I think the miracles are essential, but they point us to something much more important, which is the word of Jesus. It's a bit like saying, would you think William was alive if he wasn't breathing? The thing is, how can Jesus not come with these signs? If Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, I wouldn't believe, because everything in the Old Testament says that God's king, who has authority over you and me, who will judge you one day, who actually shines the light of his perfection into your life and mine and shows us that we fall very far short and need forgiveness tomorrow night. Not forgiveness, that's what we're going to look at tomorrow night. The resurrection of Jesus is a key part of who he is. So I think, no, I wouldn't, because it's so essential. But it's a bit like saying, would William, but the signs then point to the words that we must listen to and take seriously.
Let me bring another question forward, because I think it applies to that. You said the Old Testament points forward to the life and times and account of Jesus. A specific question here, what verses then in the Old Testament tell us that Jesus must have died and risen again?
Thank you very much. Well, for example, the Psalms are the place that the Apostle Paul goes and Peter goes in the first major Christian sermon. So, for example, he goes to Psalm 16, "You will not let your Holy One see decay." Isaiah 9 is a classic place you would go to, because Isaiah 9 tells us that the King's kingdom, God's anointed one, his Christ, his Messiah, would rule forever, an eternal rule. So Isaiah 9, Psalm 16 is a classic one. What other ones should I be talking about, Aaron?
Psalm 22.
Psalm 22, which we spoke on just after Easter. Thank you. Just tell me what there is in Psalm 22.
Well, that would speak of the cross in the
Yes.
first
Yeah.
2/3 of it,
Yes.
and then there is a change because clearly there is a resurrection.
And then Isaiah 53, where, let me just quote, "He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that we deserve was laid upon him. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone his own way, but the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Now, that speaks of, Psalm 22 speaks about his bones being dislocated, him being pierced. Psalm 69. So many, 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 many places. Daniel 12 speaks of resurrection, so does Isaiah 26, so do many of the Psalms. And that's before you get to promises, for example, in the history books of the Old Testament, speaking about this eternal kingdom. And if there's an eternal kingdom, there must be an eternal king. So we could go place after. Thanks for the prompt, Aaron. Very helpful.
We've had a bit about the miracles, which you've written, but how much it says of what it says about Jesus do you have to believe to be a Christian? Do you have to believe everything that you find, or can you pick and choose?
Well, I tell you, it depends quite what one's attitude is, I think. There's a beautiful place in the Gospels where a woman comes to Jesus and in secret touches the corner of his cloak. She just does it in secret. And Jesus then calls her out, and the culmination of that story is, "Your faith has saved you, go in peace." Now, I love that, because you look at her and you think, what kind of faith was that? Was it sort of actually slightly superstitious? As she just thought, I hope this is going to work. Do you see what I mean? There was some sort of reaching out in trust in Jesus. So I think Jesus and God is so gracious to us that as we reach out, even in the most sort of feeble way to him, he wants to see us saved. But if I come to him saying, actually, I'm only going to believe the bits I want, then I'm not sure that's recognizing him as my creator. Just let's put it in very kind of sort of everyday language. Imagine your CEO summons you tomorrow to the top floor of where it is you work, and says, and you say, well, there's a couple of things I want to say to him. And he says, well, I want you to do this, this, and this, this, and this, and this, and this. And you say, oh, thanks very much, Fred, but I think I'll just do the bits I want. What does that, what would he kind of assume about your attitude towards him? Now, if I'm approaching Jesus saying, I can see that you are gloriously powerful and good and gracious, and I want what you have to help me because I'm very weak and I reach out to him, he will answer. But if I'm coming saying, I think I really know rather better than you, Jesus, and I know you claim to be God, but really I want to stay as God, and I'll do the bits that suit me, I'm not sure that's really, that doesn't have much integrity to it. It doesn't treat him as he's revealed himself, and actually it's pretty arrogant.
Still related to the miracles, but implications. If Jesus saved people from diseases, then why doesn't he come and sort out the world's problems now?
Well, that is a huge, huge question. And obviously it relates to things like what's going on in Nepal at the moment. And it also has a very personal... Could you read the next question as well?
So then I'll read a few more which follow on. Where is Jesus in the Nepalese earthquake? If you say there's a God, and he's kind of caring. Why doesn't he create a disabled child from the start to suffer? And the third one, likewise, with all these earthly disasters, how can we trust this Jesus?
Yeah. I guess we've got just a couple of more minutes. We've got talks on suffering, which I would direct you to. Very simply, some of those questions may have been asked from deep personal experience. And I have made a little sort of promise to myself that I will never talk to anybody about personal suffering without beginning by saying, as you come to Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for you, carrying God's judgment, and face the deepest injustice and utter rejection, humiliation, and the hatred of humanity, we discover a God, not who kind of sits aloof and smiles down at our suffering, but a God who has entered into our world and knows whatever suffering it is you yourself are facing. And I suspect around the room here there'll be any number of different situations. And personally, to go through life with Jesus, who I know knows suffering at the deepest level, deeper than any of us will ever experience, to go through life with him means I can face whatever suffering comes my way with God on the inside of my life. So that's to deal with it quite subjectively, because I, from experience, would never want to do it otherwise to begin with. Then I want to stand back a bit and say, okay, I think I'd want to say, the very fact that you asked that question suggests to me that there's an unease about you seeing this world with suffering in it. But if you're a secularist, which you may be asking that question, why? Because if you believe we're all the product of random chance, and we've emerged sort of out of the whatever by pure chance and necessity, then why are you worried? Why are you worried? So I just want to ask that kind of question. Now, you're then asking the question of God. The Bible's explanation of suffering is that this world is out of kilter profoundly because it was set up by God originally, with God as ruler, with humanity as vice-regent to rule over this creation. And we're going to talk about this tomorrow, our willful rejection of God, yours and mine, humanity as a whole, our refusal to recognize the rule of God. It's rather like, you have some finely tuned machine and you drop in a pin or a needle, and all the cogs they're just kind of out. And the Bible's explanation of the suffering of this world is that it comes as a result of our human shaking our fist at God. Now, quite a lot of that, I wouldn't say there's an individual line between an individual suffering and God's judgment on this world we live in. So I don't want you to go away saying here, because I, therefore this. Sometimes that's the case, abuse, substance abuse and that sort of thing. Because I, therefore this. But much human suffering is actually caused by humans. If you go back and look at all the suffering of the last century, which was mostly created by atheists in the most grotesque wars our universe has ever known, you think of the famines around this world, actually, if we were only prepared to share and so forth. So much suffering, but then there is what we call natural disasters. I don't like that word, which is caused by the whole of humanity shaking its fist at God. And it's a foretaste of, and an indication that all is not well with our world. Ultimately, we will meet God in judgment. But now, today, he's entered the world. He offers forgiveness, and he promises a new creation beyond this world. So that's the Bible's answer. Somebody will say, oh, well, that's all very well. I'd want to sit down and say to you, well, what's your answer? And most people who I sit down actually don't have an answer. They have a sort of, oh, well, God's sitting there like this, sort of disinterested, smiling down on the world, or, oh, well, we emerge by chance, in which case, why are you bothered with suffering? you shouldn't be concerned about it at all. So, yeah.
Our time is just about out. Apologies if we didn't get to your question. Please do speak to one of us or continue chatting. But maybe, William, one last question.
Oh, can you just ask me the one about religion? I'll do it very quickly.
About what, sorry?
This one here. Those couple. There are a couple there.
Jesus' claims are big, but is the evidence big enough to mean we can respond? Don't other religions have equal evidence to back their claims? Religion involves purely setting rules to follow, knowing you'll break them and fail, feeling miserable.
I agree. I agree with the second question. Religion is miserable. I am not religious. I hate religion. Christianity is not about rules, setting rules, knowing you'll fail and feeling miserable. Quite the opposite. And I had hoped that this evening might begin to point that out. And do come again later in the week. We're not talking about religion here. Religion is man-made. It's grotesque. But I think secularism is too. Okay?
Following from that then, our last question. I think what the Bible says about Jesus is true. How can I build a real personal connection with this Jesus?
Well, let's just turn back to where we were in John 5, page 14, if you would, please. Top of the page, the first sentence there, 24, which is actually the heart of the whole matter. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life." So as I come to Jesus and listen to his teaching, to his word, I'm introduced to God. And as I meet God, I find the God who loves me and who loves me enough to die for me so that he can cleanse away everything I have done in my life, which is a very great deal, that deserves his judgment. And notice it's present. Whoever hears my word and believes has. So as I take Jesus at his word and trust him and receive him as my loving, forgiving Saviour who died for me, I am given from God life, divine life enters into my soul. It's not there now because of the things I've done against God. There's a great barrier between me and God. But as I receive the forgiveness Jesus offers, it's as if the barrier is lifted. Forgiveness and life comes into my very soul. And that's how it all starts. And that's how it goes on. Whoever receives my word. As I listen to him, any relationship, you get to know me, you have to listen to what I say, I have to listen to what you say. We grow to know each other. That's how it starts.
William, thank you very much. Just a few closing comments. We hope this will be the beginning of an exploration, of a discussion about these things. It may have been very new to you, what you heard this evening. You may have lots more questions. Here at St Helen's, we'd love to help you as best we can. Let me just suggest a few ways you might want to do that. As we've heard from William, there's a series of events going on this week. We've got further dinners in here tomorrow and Thursday night. Let me remind you of the titles. Tomorrow, William's tackling the question, why bother with Jesus? And then on Thursday, why did Jesus have to die? And then on Sunday, we meet in the morning, 10:30. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And then at 4 and 6, the title, How Can I Be Sure? You'd be very welcome to obviously come to those if you can, or they'll all go online quite quickly afterwards. We've seen this eyewitness evidence tonight. We've chatted about it quite a bit. Two particular ways you might want to follow up and check this out for yourself. One is a course called Christianity Explored that we run here at St Helen's. It's meeting with a small group. Any question is allowed, with a couple of people leading the discussion and then looking at this document, hearing what others think. You're welcome to come and ask those questions or just sit in and listen and come to your own conclusions. They run midweek evenings, midweek lunchtimes and Sunday mornings. So hopefully a time that would suit you. Under the gallery over there, you'll see there's a table, our resources table. They can give you any more information and you can sign up there for that as well. Or another way to look into the evidence, as William suggested, was one-on-one, like John's Gospel. Why not find someone who might go through this with you, where you can read it together, again, ask your questions, maybe the person who came with you this evening, or again, if you're interested, do ask at the desk and they'll be able to put you in touch with someone who can do that. On that table as well, lots of other resources and books and things you want to look at. If you've got a particular question, there might be a book about that to take away and read in your own time. The best resource of all, of course, is John's Gospel itself. Please take this away with our compliments and read it again for yourselves. Well, it's been great to have you with us this evening. We hope you might see you again this week, if that's possible. That's all now from the front. No need to rush off. Do stay for as long as you wish. Thank you.